Welcome back to Maritimes and Beyond for ACORN Canada Radio, where justice meets radio. I'm your host, Nichola Taylor. Today, we are discovering what is going on with housing in Alberta. I'm very happy to talk to the NDP MLA for Edmonton Highlands-Norwood and the Shadow Minister for Housing, MLA Janis Irwin. Thank you for joining me, Janis.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to get straight in there. So in December 2023, January 2024, after meeting with ACORN, you and the NDP put forward a private members bill for a 4-year rent cap and targets for building and tracking affordable housing. Sadly, it didn't pass because the UCP obviously have the majority. It seems the UCP doesn't seem to want to budge on the need for rent control. What message are you trying to get out about why they need to move on this?
Yeah, and I mean, just to give you some background on that, it was incredibly frustrating to just, be inundated by stories of folks all across Alberta, not just in the big cities, experiencing, double-digit rent increases, 30, 50, 80, 200% rent increases. And so, for me as an opposition MLA, you don't have a lot of legislative tools, but one of the tools you do have is a private members bill. And so I thought, well, this is one way, using rent caps, rent control, to try to address what at the time was absolutely skyrocketing rents, particularly in Edmonton and Calgary. And, at a time when so many Albertans were experiencing houselessness, and they still are, to try to keep people in their homes and to give them that sense of security. So it was incredibly frustrating that the UCP weren't even willing to talk about rent caps, let alone, debate the bill.
In New Brunswick, we also had the Higgs Progressive Conservatives, and I shall use progressive loosely. It was bad, but we managed to force them to bring in a temporary rent cap for a year. And then, they did introduce small things like a rent bank and made some changes to the rent eviction laws. However, it seems like the Alberta United Conservative Party takes more from the Trumpers in the US than the Conservatives in the rest of Canada. Would you say that's fair? Would you say that's fair? Because it just seems really out of control, especially when it comes to housing, and I'm sure lots of other things as well in where you are.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, Alberta is the largest province in Canada that has no restrictions on rent increases. The minister repeatedly, when I would talk about my bill in the legislature, and when I would share the stories of people experiencing these, unbelievable rent increases, he would talk about things like, we don't need socialist rent control that destroys, countries and cities, and yet with no evidence to back that up, right? And we're talking about those socialist provinces like Ontario, led by the Ford government, that have restrictions on rent, right? So just make it make sense. That was what was incredibly frustrating and continues to be frustrating, because the minister will shoot down any sort of policy suggestions that I bring forward, but then will offer nothing to Albertans who are struggling. And, I'm someone, in addition to being the Shadow Minister for Housing, I also represent a lot of folks who are low income. I have some of the poorest neighborhoods in Alberta, in fact, and especially in Edmonton. And, we hear from people every day who've been evicted, who've lost their homes, who don't know where their family's going to live tomorrow, right? And so for him to just, dismiss it as ideological while not offering any other solutions, is just, it's frustrating, and it's damaging to our people as well.
I agree, because again, we had a similar fight. NB ACORN, New Brunswick ACORN, had a huge fight on our hands when it came to rent control under Higgs, and we heard similar things, not about the socialist Ford government, but low to moderate income people were ignored, were swept aside. They didn't want us to be sat at the table. Anybody like yourself, representing constituents who tried to talk about it, was largely ignored. So I do see some comparisons to what it was like in New Brunswick and Alberta. Does it worry you that the efforts like ACORN Alberta are doing, and yourselves and the NDP are doing, are falling on deaf ears, and in return leaving low to moderate income people in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah, absolutely. And shout out to you folks in New Brunswick and the Alberta ACORN people who are doing amazing work. They've done some really cool things, not just on rent, but also on protecting tenants when it comes to, extreme temperatures and
Yeah.
tenants' rights broadly. And so I'm a big supporter of them, and I think I'm a monthly donor now too. So
Oh, right.
yeah, so shout out to them. No, and it is incredibly concerning that it feels like we're going nowhere. And, in the 6 years since I've been an MLA, that's the 6 years also since the UCP haven't been in government because they were elected in 2019 and so was I. We've seen houselessness triple in Edmonton alone, right?
Mm.
So, again, I'm not an idiot. Rent control isn't going to solve the housing crisis, but it's one piece, right? In addition, and I've said this so many times, Nichola, in addition to building the affordable housing that's needed, the
Yeah.
permanent supportive housing that's needed, as well as investing in things like rent subsidies or rent supplements, which are another good way to support low income Albertans. But on all of those prongs, and of course rent control as well, the UCP government is not delivering. So,
Mm.
when renters ask me what's the government doing for them, the list is very short because there's nothing on it, right? And that's
Yeah.
and that's what's troubling. But I think the positive piece, or I got 6 years of being in opposition, you can be a little bit cynical at times. So I always got to look for hope. And I think the hopeful piece is we are building right now the Alberta NDP to not just be the largest opposition as we are right now in Alberta's history, but to be the government next time around. And I've committed to ACORN and to so many of my constituents and folks across the province that should we form government, we need to prioritize protections for renters.
Now, NB Acorn was able to ride the wave of anger around massive uncontrolled rent increases to victory. The Liberal government that was voted last October made rent control its first order of business after being elected. So now I see the massive rent increases have subsided a little bit in Alberta. How do we fight rent control in Alberta when rents come down a bit or flatten as they are now? Because we all know there's going to be another boom and, rents will start going up. How can tenants secure themselves if and when that happens?
Yeah, and that bothers me so much when, even when we were last in the legislature in the spring, I'd asked about rents and the minister said something like, well, actually, rents are stabilizing because for I believe it was about 18 consecutive months. I'd have to check my numbers on that. It was definitely longer than a year. Rents in Edmonton and Calgary were like this. So rents in Edmonton and Calgary were rising faster than anywhere else in the country, and the data from rentals.ca supports that. So faster than anyone else. Our rents aren't higher than other cities, like they weren't the highest rents, but they were increasing faster than anywhere else. And so, we had that data, and that was part of the impetus to keep pushing for my bill. And of course, now that rents have stabilized, particularly in Calgary, they're still rising in Edmonton overall. But that doesn't mean we need to stop pushing because exactly what you said. I mean, Alberta in particular, we are incredibly susceptible to the boom and bust economy. We've all seen, I mean, I'm 40 years old, so I've seen booms and busts in this province myself, right?
Yeah.
We've seen, what happens when you're focused on a resource-based economy, and people are rushing to our province, and people are leaving our province, and the impact that has on rents across Alberta. So yes, while rents may have stabilized right now, that does not mean that anytime in the future rents again could be skyrocketing. And so I want us to put measures in place now. May not
Yeah.
be successful being an opposition MLA, if not now, as soon as I have the ability to do so. Because again, we're talking about the lives of my constituents and of my colleagues across this province, right? And I'm not being hyperbolic because it really is, housing is healthcare, right?
Yeah.
Housing saves lives. Safe,
Yeah.
affordable, accessible housing is just so critical to any person's well-being. And so, and I mean, look at me, I'm in my yard. I'm so privileged to have a roof over my head, for me and for my two cat sons, right? So look at me, I'm an example of somebody who's got a home, but there are so many folks who don't, and who don't have the stability of knowing that their rent's not going to go up next month, right? How hard is it? I'm sure you've heard these stories too of people just trying, like, how hard is it to budget buying food, paying for car or for transit, utilities, which are also increasing here under the UCP government, uh, and not knowing how much your rent could go up. And again, in Alberta, it's just the Wild West out here. So your rent could go up $500 next month. It could go up $5 regardless. It's pretty hard to budget when you're on an extremely tight budget.
I agree, and I think it's because there's no law or no cap or anything, it really does put people who are on those low incomes in a very precarious situation. Rent cap does bring that safety net. And, we've heard heartbreaking stories, as I'm sure you have with your constituents, how, I remember, there's so many that stick in your mind, the really prominent ones. And one lady, she was a senior in tears that when we were still under Higgs, saying that I am one more rent increase away from homelessness. And when you are, nobody wants to be homeless. But if you are a senior and you've worked all your life and you've put into the country, you've paid your taxes, you've done all this, and this is how the government treat you, then it shows lack of regard, disrespect, and everything else simply because you are a low income earner. And to these people, it means nothing. That's what I see it as.
Exactly right. We're talking young people, we're talking seniors. I still remember the story. And this one, of course, this one is extreme, but it's a real story of a woman, a senior in Calgary, who experienced an $1,800 increase.
Oh my gosh.
Increase,
Oh my
right?
goodness. Oh,
Yeah. So, I mean, just like think about someone like that where, like, she's been in her rental unit for so long, and the owner decided that they wanted to they've been charging low rents all along, and they could make a whole lot more money in Calgary when, again, rents were rising rapidly. But like, nobody, what Albertan could afford an $1,800 increase? And again, I know that's an extreme one, but we heard stories like that from seniors all over, $200, $500, right? And
yeah.
again, like you said, it's about that stability, it's about that assurance of knowing that your rent's not going to increase next month, and it's about, just like I said, it's about mental health, and it's about your well-being.
Really, it is. It is, because that can have a detrimental effect, especially if you're having to move constantly because your rents are not stable. And if you've been in your home for a long time, as some people are, and then suddenly, like this lady, you get hit with a massive increase. It doesn't always have to be big, but it's not within your budget, that you have to move. And you
Yeah.
have the stress of trying to look for something within your budget. It really does impact you in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of it is it's about community, right? And I
Yeah.
mean, we've had examples here in Edmonton. There were some lovely folks. I'm not sure if you heard about them out in New Brunswick, but they were living in a building called the Animo Mansion. So it's not actually a mansion, but it's just a historic building in Edmonton, pretty modest, modest building. And they were all experiencing huge rent increases, and it's just like people who'd lived there for years and years, and again, they'd built up a community, and nearly all of them were being forced to move, right? And so,
Yeah.
and it was, for them, it was like, man, this is our community. This is my, this is my family. And just meeting with some of those folks, and just hearing their heartbreaking stories, when you're somebody who lives alone and you've finally found those connections, right? And people there were experiencing 200% rent increases. It was there again, $1,800 jump for a lot of those units, because the owner thought, hey, I can I can make a whole lot more money, a whole lot more profit on this building. And again, like, where are those folks supposed to go?
Yeah. And who's stopping the landlords, from doing that? They can get away with that. Um, ACORN is looking to expand to Edmonton, which is your city. What
Yeah.
inspires you to keep fighting in a province like Alberta, that lacks a lot of protections for vulnerable people that other provinces have.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I mean, it is hard sometimes. And, when it was, as you mentioned at the outset of this interview, um, a big part of my impetus for pushing for a bill with rent control was because of my meeting with ACORN. And, they offered, when we met with them, myself and an MLA from Calgary, Joe Cece, who's been a good advocate for tenant rights as well. When we first met with them together, they kind of had a clear outline of what they wanted to see in a
Yeah,
bill. And I mostly followed it. In fact, I even went above and beyond what they wanted, right? Because I knew it was time, right? I knew it was time.
yeah,
And I think what was so disheartening is, I mean, they were all realists. They understand the government that we're up against, but to be flooded with stories, to be flooded with people who were signing petitions in support of this bill, and then for the UCP to not even really give it the light of day, right? To kill it almost immediately. Um, it's just such a slap in the face, right? But that's
yeah,
that's been par for the course for this conservative government. Fun fact on that. So that was a private member's bill. And again, I still got to be optimistic. And maybe there was a small, small chance that some of the UCP members could support it. They didn't. We propose every session multiple private members' bills. Do you know how many private members' bills of ours they've supported over the last 6 years that I've been an MLA?
I don't, none. Hopefully they've done some.
But the answer is none. Yeah,
None.
you might think, well, they've probably at least supported a few, because what's funny is this UCP government will talk about collaborating with the NDP, and say that that's an important thing, is that we can work together. And I hear that from Albertans all the time, that they want to see that, right? They've supported a couple of our private members' motions, which
Okay.
are like, less binding, and they're not bills, right? So that's just like what's incredibly frustrating. And then how many of the UCP private members' bills get passed?
All
Pretty much
probably.
all of them. Not
Yeah.
all of them. There was one that we were able to kill about, basically it was a nod to like the far right and the
Mm,
anti-abortion folks. Anyways, long story short, I'm going off on a tangent there, Nichola, but the point being, it's like, when I hear Albertans, they want to see us at least trying to collaborate and trying to put forward good policy. But we can't, because we have a
yeah.
government that's unwilling to even listen, right? Unwilling to even support any legislation if it doesn't come from their side.
Right. So you're up against it, really. And that brings me on then to the final question, because I know you have another meeting. So you are heading into an election cycle in 2027. Um, it happened in New Brunswick against all odds. We didn't think, we could get Higgs out.
Yeah.
We got him out because people had enough, and they felt we had that strong feeling people needed change and they wanted change. Are you getting that sense now? Because I know there's so many things going on in Alberta. Obviously, especially from low to moderate income, obviously the housing will be a very big issue that I'm guessing you'll run on. But you've also got this separatist weird notion that people are trying to separate from the rest of Canada and all that going on. I mean, are people really supporting that, or is this just another thing that's come up from the UCP? What are your biggest issues, do you think, going into that cycle?
Yeah, and so you've nailed it. We are 2 years out of an election in theory. However, we in the NDP need to be prepared for an election to come earlier, right? And fun fact on that one, I mean, it was this UCP government. The election was originally scheduled for spring of 2027, and of course, being the authoritarian government they are, they pushed it back to October 2027. So I've
Mm,
been door knocking a lot in my riding here in beautiful Edmonton Highlands-Norwood, almost every day this summer. And you know, I'm hearing from people all the time. One of their first questions is like, "Wait, Janis, is there an election coming up?" No, there's not a provincial election. Unlikely to happen very soon. We do have a municipal election here in the fall. Um, but people are saying, I'll come to the door and I'll say, "Hey, I'm Janis. I'm your MLA. It's not an election right now, but I just want to know what's top of mind for you provincially." And one of
yeah,
the most common answers I get is, how do we get rid of Danielle Smith in the UCP, right? And
Oh,
so that's why I say, listen, that's why I'm doing this work right now. Me and my colleagues across the province, we are knocking on doors, we are connecting with Albertans, we're hosting town halls, we're attending events from, from the north to I was going to say from Fort McMurray to Fort Macleod, but that probably doesn't mean a lot to you, but from the north to the south, all over the province, right? And when I ask people what else their top issues are, they say things like healthcare, right? Investing and strengthening public health care across the province,
yeah,
education. We're headed into the next school year, right? And we need to know that our teachers are supported, our education assistants are supported, and our students as well. And housing comes up too, especially
yeah,
in the sense of supporting our unhoused neighbors. In my neighborhood, we've got a lot of folks who are struggling, who don't have homes. How can we support them? How can we provide the mental health supports, the wraparound services that they need? And how can we keep people housed, right? How can we look at
yeah,
things like rents? How can we ensure that folks across the province have accessible, affordable housing? So I hear all these things. I know that Albertans are paying attention. And then the final piece is, you know what? Even in my riding, which is a pretty strong NDP riding, which I'll never take for granted, people will say to me, hey, Janis, you know what? I'm a conservative. I don't typically vote NDP, but this is not my form of conservatism. This
mm,
separatism, this stoking the fires of a far right base, this is not my conservative Alberta, right?
yeah,
I've truly, I'm not exaggerating. I've truly had so many people over the last few weeks, especially when I've been knocking on their doors, say that for the first time, they're thinking about voting NDP because they can't support a premier who is wanting to separate from Canada, right? Who is attacking various members of our communities, who is unwilling to, support and address the issues that people care about, like healthcare, like education. And so we're listening to that and we're working
yeah.
hard. And you know what? In 2027, I hope, if not sooner, we can form the next government, the second Alberta NDP government ever, and we can address the issues that matter so much to our constituents.
I hope you do as well. I hope you see a massive orange wave, because even if you look back at the federal election that went, that's what scared a lot of conservatives again, is this shift to the far right. They felt this is not Canadian. This is not Canadian conservatism. And it's very much like our neighbours to the south, and we don't want that. So even though obviously you do have pockets of people like that, it's not as widespread as these Daniela Smith or Pierre Poilievre think. And that gives me a hope as well, that, the majority of Canadians do not want to go to that shift. So I'm wishing you all the best, and continue the good work in what you're doing in your riding, but also speaking out for those who really need that voice. I know it's disheartening because it seems like no one's listening, but at least there is a voice, speaking for those people who are on low to moderate incomes, and they know that someone is listening to them and trying to fight hard for them and put it in their, put their voice in the parliament at least. So great job, really. So
Thank you
yeah.
so much. No, thank you for reaching out. Thank you again for the work that ACORN's doing in New Brunswick and across Canada. I see it and I support it, and I hope that we can get a chapter here in Edmonton, and we'll keep fighting. And if any of your members see this interview and want to reach out, please do so. So thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me again. And yeah, we are going to establish one in Edmonton, so look out for that. And I'll remind everyone else that you have been listening to another episode of Maritimes and Beyond for ACORN Canada Radio, where Justice Meets Radio. Join me for our next episode. Thank you very much.